Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for another Q&A session, this time for February 2023. You guys asked another great range of questions this month between our Discord community for Hardware Unboxed supporters and also the YouTube community tab. So we'll be able to get to all of them in this particular video. We'll get to a lot of the good ones, a lot of the upvoted ones, and also, often some of you guys do ask for various different testing or guides or things like that, which hopefully I'll be getting to in upcoming videos. Speaking of guides, today's video is sponsored by Scribe, the free browser extension for Chrome that allows you to easily auto-generate step-by-step guides with just a click of a button. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to create a guide showing our Patreon members how to access our monitor OSD settings. All I need to do is install the extension, click on the Scribe icon in Chrome, and start recording. Then I navigate through our posts to find the link and how to search for your monitor in our spreadsheet. After saving the recording, Scribe automatically generates a step-by-step guide complete with screenshots and the actions I took. A few bits of editing to add in more information for our users, and it's complete, ready to share. It's that easy with the Scribe extension, and while the free version will be just fine for most of you, Scribe Pro even extends this functionality to support desktop app recording and screenshot customization. If you're interested in trying out Scribe for free, click our link in the description below. It's really that easy. All right, let's get to the first question. With so many new OLED monitors on the horizon, do you think it's worth investing into one now, or maybe waiting until the back half of the year to see what the market brings? I think it's a really good question because obviously at the moment we've seen new OLED monitors hit the market. We've got the Alienware one from last year and of course now the LG 27-inch 1440p monitor, which I think will be the sort of main toss-up between people who are wanting OLED technology to be their next gaming monitor. And luckily we do have a comparison of those two products on this very channel right now. I think though, for a lot of people who are considering OLED and are sort of maybe on the fence or wanting to assess whether they should jump in right now, I reckon waiting at least a couple of months is probably the way to go at the moment. And I say that because there are a number of other monitors that will be using very similar panels coming to market shortly. So on the Alienware QD OLED side, we're expecting to see a Samsung equivalent, the G8 OLED, which is available actually in a number of countries right now. I believe it's coming to Australia in March. So that's probably around when we'll be able to test it, but that is another product that is slowly rolling out worldwide. And then we have the MSI equivalent as well. So I believe there's more versions than that. I think I've seen a Philips one, maybe some other versions there too. But certainly if you are interested in the Alienware monitor, either the DW or the DWF, and you sort of maybe you didn't like one aspect of performance or had a nitpick about that particular product, there is a chance that if you wait a little bit, you'll be able to find something that may be more suited to you in the Samsung monitor, the MSI monitor, or other variants. And the same thing does apply to the LG model as well. We've seen monitors announced from Asus, Acer, and a few others that are expected to use the very same panel. Now, with all of these cases, whether we're talking QD OLED or the LG W OLED panels, we're not expecting the fundamentals of those panels to change significantly. So things like response times, color gamut, those aspects will be very similar between the different variants that are available to you. But certainly later in this year, you will have a better variety of monitors that may cater a bit better to exactly what you're after. And maybe we'll see some price wars as well. I'm not sure how much of a battle they'll be able to get into on pricing, because obviously monitor pricing is dictated largely by the cost of the panel itself, which will be a fixed cost between all of the manufacturers. But maybe we'll see a few discounts, prices get a bit lower because there will be more options available for people. So I guess that's generally what I would be thinking of, whether you wanted to buy OLED now or later. However, I wouldn't be expecting any major changes to the panel formats that we've seen. We have seen some announcements of a few different types of ultra wides and things like that. But if you're wanting for example, 27-inch 4K OLED or 32-inch OLED monitor, it doesn't really sound like that sort of option is on the cards, at least this year. So yeah, it'll be more around, am I satisfied with the monitors that are on the market today with these panels, or should I be waiting, seeing if there's pricing differences or maybe some other differences between the options using the same panel? Would better cooling of an OLED display, for example with more airflow, chilled air or mods, bring higher brightness for large areas, or is the firmware usually so locked down that it doesn't matter? Yeah, interesting question. Obviously OLED brightness is a big talking point these days. I think if we're talking about hardware design side of things in terms of adding heat sinks to OLED monitors, we have seen that does increase the brightness capabilities of certain panels or TVs. We've generally seen that the panels that do include those sorts of features have higher brightness. It tends to be more limited to small window size brightness. So for example, a monitor that has no cooling versus a monitor that has cooling, like a heatsink, for example. So, it may be able to get 200 nits brighter in the circumstance where we do have those cooling capabilities. But of course, this is a hardware thing that has to be built into the monitor and something that you specifically look out for when you purchase it. We've seen in our own testing that a product like the Asus PG42UQ, which does claim to have additional cooling capabilities compared to LG's own C2 TVs, does indeed have higher brightness than the C2 in some circumstances. But certainly for full screen brightness, that tends to be fairly similar between the monitors and TVs and things that at least I've seen, whether or not they have cooling or no cooling, or at least improved cooling versus standard cooling. So from that side of things, I don't expect that will change significantly, unfortunately. It's more things like WOLED versus QD-OLED that gives us big differences in terms of full screen brightness. As far as you yourself as an end user taking an existing monitor and trying to cool it better yourself, I haven't seen any evidence that that would significantly improve the performance of a product. Most of the time, the brightness capabilities and brightness tracking of monitors is hard-coded into the firmware. And we even see evidence of that just without looking at cooling at all, because some monitors, the LG 27GR95QE that we just tested is one example, where full screen SDR brightness is actually quite a lot higher than the full screen HDR brightness. Now, there's no reason that the HDR performance couldn't be brighter for full screen images. That's just a simple firmware difference. It's got nothing to do with the cooling capabilities of the monitor, because under the same temperature, you can very much get higher brightness in the SDR mode. So a lot of those brightness things are very much firmware limitations, and it does seem like manufacturers that are integrating these panels, again, they all typically come from the same manufacturer, while they can tweak things slightly depending on the hardware and capabilities that they've got in their product, they are still largely limited by overall design guidelines. So, for example, again, that PG42UQ, despite having that enhanced cooling capabilities, it doesn't have much higher full screen brightness than the other monitors that we've seen that use OLED technology. So, yeah, I don't expect that buyers buying OLED monitors will be able to add fans or major heatsinks and expect to see immediate performance improvements. This isn't like a processor or graphics card where potentially you're able to just, chuck in a better cooler. It's not thermal throttling anymore. You can get better performance. It does seem to be more of a firmware thing. I'm not ruling out that there are some firmware hidden menus that you can use to change things. I haven't really looked into that side of things. I guess that's more of an overclocking thing. But certainly I would expect that the off-the-shelf performance that you see from an OLED will be the same, regardless of whether you're chilling it or whether it's run under normal conditions. The one downside of my monitor's specs is that it can't do 10-bit color at its highest refresh rate. How big of a downgrade do you feel 8-bit color is, and where would you even notice it? So, yeah, this is one where I honestly don't think the difference between 10-bit and 8-bit is all that significant. Most monitors these days in their 10-bit mode will still be using an 8-bit native panel and then be using FRC or dithering techniques to improve that to 10-bit. There are some monitors that do have the native 10-bit performance. A lot of the time those are professional monitors. I think some of the new OLED monitors do have true 10-bit capabilities as well. But for the vast majority of 10-bit gaming displays that we see, the actual 10-bit mode is still mostly 8-bit. And honestly, I don't think for most circumstances that there's a significant visual difference between 8 and 10-bit, certainly not for most gaming and content consumption circumstances and use cases. It really doesn't look very different. The main differences that we see with 10-bit are things like improved gradient handling. That's really where higher bit depths tend to benefit monitors. You get smoother handling of gradients. But a lot of the time these days, even 8-bit monitors can use dithering without running in their 10-bit mode anyway. So side by side, you may be running in a monitor in its 8-bit mode and then in its 10-bit mode. And even for things like gradients, the two modes will look very similar. So based on that, I don't really think this is too much of a concern. Certainly, ideally, you'd want to run the monitor in its 10-bit mode for those edge cases where 10-bit may give you an advantage for things like gradients. But for content consumption and watching movies, playing games, you don't see gradients that often. It tends to be a brief scene where you may see like the sky in a gradient or things like that, where there may be that benefit. And also it depends on the content that you're actually watching as well, whether that's true 10-bit content. HDR does tend to be 10-bit or even 12-bit. Games as well, what sort of settings they're using, how they're processing colors and things like that. So yeah, for general content consumption, I don't think the difference matters that much. Where it may matter more is for people who are using it for content creation, where gradients, things like that, you do need the most accurate representation of what those things will look like, especially if something is going out to be printed. You wouldn't want to see something on your display that has an ugly gradient or effect of a low bit depth when the actual printer and printing process will mean that artifact isn't there. Or maybe you accidentally make something that has a gradient that doesn't look great, and then you're not really sure whether it's your display or how it will look when it's printed. Those are all the considerations as a creator that you'd want that additional bit depth, and why a lot of monitors that are creative focused and professional focused will have that increased bit depth. But again, yeah, not something that I'd be super concerned with. I would typically just recommend running your monitor in 8-bit if you can't run it at the 10-bit capabilities at the maximum refresh rate. Don't think it makes too much of a difference. Will FALD monitors have a benefit in desktop and SDR use, or is it only useful for HDR? So many reviews I've seen on FALD monitors say to disable local dimming outside of HDR, but being able to get better contrast without going OLED seems very useful for SDR consumption and creation. This is a difficult one because it really depends on the type of monitor that you've got and the technology, how many dimming zones and all that, as to how useful full array local dimming is for SDR and desktop content. I think if we're talking about SDR content consumption, so for example, watching SDR videos or playing games in the SDR mode, generally I think that you can enable FALD in those circumstances, because often you're not really going to be seeing hard gradient, hard edges to apps. You're not going to be seeing large areas of uniform colors. Text is less likely, especially while watching videos, and all those things look great on FALD. It's basically the same as HDR, right? Like HDR, we know the benefits there are for content consumption, watching videos, playing games. You can do the same thing in SDR with FALD on and get a good enhanced contrast experience. You won't benefit as much because SDR does have a different gamma curve, EOTF curve, which means that there's not as much data allocated to the dark shades, which means that for SDR, the FALD backlight isn't going to be doing as much. There's not going to be as much usage of shadow content and shadow detail. So the benefits there will be limited compared to running it in the HDR mode, but definitely there will be a benefit there for having that feature enabled. Why I generally recommend people disable FALD for desktop use comes down to a couple of things. The primary one is productivity apps or desktop apps. Often what you see with an FALD screen when viewing a desktop application is that your cursor, text, things like that, edges of content will have haloing or quite bright sort of rings around certain parts of the content. So for example, if we're looking at, I think one of the things that's really obvious to me is the Steam user interface on some monitors with FALD, because the Steam interface is sort of that dark gray shade. FALD is active. The backlights are dimming down a little bit to enhance the contrast for that scene. But then as you're moving the cursor around or viewing some of the text elements or clicking on things, you will see that halo around the cursor or other objects, which I think looks pretty ugly. And this can also rear its head in creator applications, things like Photoshop, for example. Again, that app uses a gray background, generally speaking, is quite a dark interface. And then as you're moving things around the screen, as you're maybe working on the image in that workflow, you might see haloing around this sort of harsh edge between the content you're working on and the interface. So from my perspective, I think for desktop apps, definitely FALD disabled tends to look the best, gives you the most uniform experience, which is better for those productivity apps, web browsing, and creator applications. But again, if you're using content consumption is your primary focus for SDR, then you can probably leave it enabled. I also think the benefit of having FALD disabled for SDR but enabled for HDR allows you to separate those two use cases a little bit better between desktop apps and content consumption. For example, you could still use the HDR mode in Windows to run your SDR content, for example, videos as one example, and rely on tone mapping to get the best experience with FALD enabled, and then switch to the SDR mode where FALD is disabled for your productivity apps and things where you may see those halos becoming more obvious for things like, again, Photoshop, web browsers, things like that. And I tend to find that works as sort of the best combination on those monitors. HDR mode for content consumption, including SDR apps, and then the SDR mode for your desktop apps. So yeah, that tends to be the way I look at things. Certainly OLED does give you an advantage there, and that you don't really have to worry about that sort of thing. But yeah, FALD does give you that advantage for content consumption. I would recommend keeping it on in those circumstances. Why aren't there more 16 by 10 aspect ratio high-end gaming monitors? It works great for all types of content, productivity and gaming. If there were OLED options in this aspect ratio, the small black bars would be even less of an issue. Yeah, this is a great question, and it's something that I don't really understand. Well, I guess there's a couple of perspectives as to why a monitor manufacturer wouldn't prioritize a 16 by 10 aspect ratio monitor, and I imagine a large portion of that is that buyers are preferring 16 by 9 aspect ratios or other formats. So if your majority of buyers are going, hey, I'm fine with my 27-inch 16 by 9 monitor, 32-inch 16 by 9, the most common formats for gaming monitors, then there's no real incentive or no significant incentive to experiment with that slightly extended 16 by 10 aspect ratio, despite it being super popular quite a while ago. So I imagine that, when we're talking about monitors, which again, some panels aren't shipped in significant volumes, there are lots of panels that are fairly niche products and niche use cases that don't sell heaps, to then make another format that's maybe even more niche, it may not justify the engineering and design costs to make that sort of product. That's where I imagine a lot of the 1610 discussion comes from. Obviously, the reason we moved away from 1610 to 16:9 as the preferred format for desktop use was that was the emerging format at the time for video content. So with a lot of people using monitors for watching videos or working in that sort of area or playing games, and you want that sort of standard size format, 16 by 9 became the preferred method, and 16 by 10 unfortunately died away a little bit. I think it is a great format. I'd love to see more monitor manufacturers experiment with sort of that taller monitor, even if it is for gaming. Obviously, we've got plenty of options for width. You can go from 16:9, 21:9, 32:9, really crazy formats these days if you want to go that ultra wide and immersive format. But yeah, if you're someone that uses your monitor that's more balanced between gaming and content creation or productivity apps, then 16 by 10 does make more sense. So hopefully we do see a few more of those monitors come back into fashion over time. It will become more of sort of an experimenting thing. You release one monitor, you see what's the sort of reception for 16 by 10 versus 16 by 9 at sort of similar specs and capabilities, see how they sell. Unfortunately, if 16 by 10 doesn't sell super well, then maybe they won't go with that. There's other considerations as well, like the mother glass that they use to produce a lot of displays these days. Maybe cutting it down to a 16 by 10 aspect ratio isn't as economical as 16 by 9, or it isn't as well designed for 16 by 10. So yeah, there's many reasons why they may not decide to do that at the moment. But like I said, I think more experimenting with different display formats is only a good thing and something I'd like to see happen more. Next question. Why do monitor prices and models in general have a slower refresh cycle than other PC components, while monitor is also the most diverse in terms of option and configuration? Yeah, I think the basis of this question is definitely true in terms of we don't see as much advancement as quickly on the monitor side as we see from CPUs and GPUs. GPUs, as one example, we've seen quite significant performance improvements in just a couple of years, 50% more performance, a doubling of performance. Whereas on the monitor side, it's obviously a much slower burn to get faster response times, new resolutions, HDR capabilities. Yeah, it takes a lot longer to develop those sorts of features. I think the main reason why we see this, perhaps the most obvious reason, is really the development cycles of the panels themselves. A lot of the time, what we're seeing from monitors is dictated by those panel manufacturers, and a lot of the formats and things that we see at the moment have been very similar for some time now. If we're talking about 4K monitors as one example, that has obviously been a format that's available for some time, and for let's say we're moving to 8K as one example, there's not a huge incentive at the moment to transition to 8K. There's not as much content. It's very demanding on hardware for gaming as one standpoint, and the market for a product like an 8K gaming monitor is probably not there at the moment. Things like refresh rates have been increasing steadily over time. I guess a decade ago, we were just seeing the introduction of high refresh rate monitors at the time, so 120, 144 hertz. These days we're seeing 240 Hz, 360 Hz, 540 Hz. So in the space of a decade, certainly refresh rates have increased substantially. We've seen the introduction of OLED technology and things like that. But yeah, once a new technology has been introduced to the market, it does take a while for those additional features to come out. I expect part of this as well comes down to the monitor market in general as well. So for example, a lot of the new technologies, the exciting things that we see, typically debut in the high end, and high-end monitors are not a huge volume category. They're certainly not as sold, they don't see the volume of sales that you might see from high-end TVs, or certainly expensive TVs compared to monitors. OLED TVs, even though they cost $2,000, $1,500, $2,000, those typically sell quite a lot more than you would see from a $1,000 gaming monitor, which is of course a high-end category for gaming monitors. So when you're talking about a more niche market for the new cutting edge technologies, that's tend to going to slow the pace a little bit for those advancements, because there's not as many people buying. They can't invest as much money into that sort of manufacturing, and generally monitors tend to get it's not really the scraps or the offcuts of other types of panel manufacturing, but certainly it's a lesser priority. So all those things, we've seen HDR as one example of an area that has been very slow to develop for desktop formats, as opposed to TVs, where that was introduced much earlier. And again, I imagine a lot of that is because economies of scale, the amount of people that could afford $1,500, $2,000 gaming monitors with true HDR capabilities may not have justified the advancements there until some of those cost challenges are solved. That said, I do think that the cost side of things, in terms of technologies getting cheaper, I think the pace of those sorts of things has been reasonably good. We've seen products like 1440p 165 Hz come down from $500 for good performance, I would say about 4 years ago, and nowadays you can get that for half the price at a very similar sort of level of performance. So within 4 to 5 years, getting those technologies significantly cheaper, I think is good improvements that are probably on pace with what we see in sort of the component side of things. But on top of that, one aspect is simply that a lot of people don't consider upgrading their monitors for 5, 6, 7 years in a lot of cases. So again, the incentive there for monitor manufacturers to exceed that sort of pace isn't really there if people are settled into that cycle of, I'm going to upgrade my monitor every 5 years. Whereas on the GPU side, people may be upgrading every 2 or 3 years. And, they're just different markets where people are used to different things. Although DSC is convenient to achieve high resolutions and refresh rates, it introduces many issues like not supporting long or low quality cables, has issues with KVMs, and with NVIDIA, you actually lose features such as DSR and DLDSR. Many buyers fall into the pitfall of buying monitors that rely on DSC and will only discover some of those issues after the purchase. To make matters worse, it might not be clear for the average Joe what's happening. Shouldn't monitor brands explicitly and clearly explain when DSC is used and what that means for the experience? Shouldn't this be added to your final table checklist when brands don't disclose it requires DSC as dodgy advertising by omission? So, I certainly get the frustration with people that have bought DSC monitors and then they can't use it for a variety of reasons, or they have issues with things like cables and losing features. But I don't think this is necessarily dodgy advertising. DSC is a part of the HDMI and DisplayPort specifications, like many other features. So for example, DSC is a feature like variable refresh rate or auto low latency mode for things like HDMI 2.1. So unfortunately, with the way these specifications are laid out, it's not mandatory to support all of the features, but certainly those features are part of it, and monitor brands can choose to use that quite fairly. So I would expect that any display device that says that it supports a certain technology, for example, the display output supporting HDMI 2.1, that should be capable of all of the features if required by a monitor. So that would include DSE, that would include variable refresh rates, that would include auto low latency mode. I think those are all sort of baseline expectations and features, and this applies to, basically every sort of product. A KVM that was advertising DisplayPort 1.4 functionality, or 1.4a, or 2.0, or HDMI 2.1 KVM, I'm not sure, whichever one of those things applies to that particular device, that it should properly be supporting DSC technology, because DSC is part of the spec. So if it's an HDMI 2.1 advertised product that doesn't actively or accurately work with DSC, then that's a failure of that product. It's not so much an issue with the monitor, because the monitor is just using an aspect of the specification that is valid and useful for those particular products. Again, yeah, it would be handy for monitor manufacturers to go more in depth on the specifications that they offer, the various different features from HDMI or DisplayPort that they are supporting. Again, it would be useful to see things like whether VRR is supported for HDMI, because that benefits console users. There's many different specifications that would be very useful for monitor brands to include, but I think DSC is one of the ones that is probably less relevant and useful. As far as the NVIDIA side of things with DSR and DLDSR, again, that's not a problem with the monitor. That is a problem with NVIDIA GPUs not supporting DSC and those features simultaneously. And that's something that NVIDIA will need to work around and figure out a way to get those features working. Again, I think DSC is a perfectly valid form of connectivity for high refresh rate monitors. If NVIDIA is saying, hey, we support DSC monitors, and then saying, oh, well, we don't support DSR and DLDSR, then it's really on their DSC implementation and how they're working those features as to whether or not they can claim that they've got full DSC support if it's actually restricting other forms of functionality. So yeah, I think the main concern that I would see from DSC that is on the monitor side of things is more things like cable quality and cable support. If a monitor is using DSC and that requires a high quality cable, then that's probably something the monitor manufacturer should provide. And maybe people need to be a bit more aware of cable quality for high bit rates and things like DSC capabilities. But yeah, like I said, I think it is a function of display connectivity these days. I expect it's only going to get more used as displays increase in resolution and refresh rate. We'll see more and more DSC products. So having all these additional devices that connect to things, supporting or not supporting DSC is not great, and they really should be integrating that support. For example, one of the products that we talk about frequently in monitor reviews is the PlayStation 5 supporting HDMI 2.1. Does it support does it work well on the 24 gigabits per second monitors, or do you need the 48 gigabits per second monitors? The only reason why that's any consideration is that the PlayStation 5 doesn't support DSC. If it did support DSC over HDMI 2.1, then those monitors with 24 gigabits per second ports that rely on DSC would be a complete non-issue. And I guess in my perspective, why I would still, you need to be recommending to customers the products that make sense for those use cases. So if that is a limitation for them, then maybe, a monitor that is better suited to the PlayStation 5's capabilities makes more sense to buy. But certainly the issue is more on the side of the PlayStation than it is on the monitors. If they had enabled that HDMI feature, like they probably should have, then it would work across a much wider variety of displays. So yeah, I guess that's my opinion on DSC. Probably should be talked about and advertised. Again, probably be useful to see things like a switch in the OSD settings, but I don't think it's a significant issue for most people. And as I said, it's a correct and valid way of using the specifications for connectivity that we have today. I really want to buy an OLED display, given all the improvements that have been made for this technology. However, I'm also a programmer and stare at text a lot. I'm scared of all the problems that prevent those monitors from being recommended as productivity devices. Should I give up and opt for IPS, or are those concerns exaggerated? Yeah, obviously there's a lot of discussion about OLED tech these days and its usefulness for desktop apps and productivity, the main concerns being burn-in and the subpixel layout. I certainly don't think those concerns are exaggerated for productivity apps. There has been evidence of people using OLED monitors, mainly WOLED, but we're starting to see a few things with QD-OLED as well, of if you do the things that are not recommended, like viewing static content for long periods of time, then those areas that are static for long periods of time will burn in on those monitors. And there's certainly been plenty of examples of people that have achieved that with their OLED displays for productivity. I think Linus Tech Tips in his video is probably one of the more high profile examples of that happening. So it certainly can happen. So I don't think it's exaggerated, but it really depends on your use case as to how much of a concern that should be. I think the subpixel layout issue, while it's not ideal for text rendering, it doesn't look as good as an IPS. If you are looking at text all day and a lot of the time, you probably will get used to what it looks like. So if you really want the extra benefits of OLED, such as its black levels and HDR performance, if you're using it for gaming as well, then you probably can get away with the subpixel text issues. It's not going to make text unreadable. So for your programming work. It's not going to be a situation where you can't read the code that you're writing. It will just mean that it's a little bit blurrier, it's a little bit less crisp. Maybe it will limit how small you can make the text compared to something on IPS because of the crispness and clarity of the image. But yeah, I don't expect that will be a significant factor. It's more just a downside and something that you may consider going IPS versus OLED for that use case. I really think the biggest issue for this is burn-in. If you are a programmer that's sitting at your OLED screen for like 8 hours a day, where you just got one application open or maybe a couple of applications that are generally the same applications, like your programming workflow, maybe a web browsing application, yeah, I would expect there's a risk there of that burning in over time. And it's probably a reason why I wouldn't recommend someone programming using an OLED display. Then again, I know a lot of programmers do prefer dark mode as a way to program, where the main interface is black or largely black and then the text is bright. I think that's significantly less likely to burn in. So if that's your use case, if you're a programmer that uses dark mode or uses a dark interface, and you're combining that with other apps that are generally used in dark mode, and you enable all of the screen protection features, pixel shifting, and all that sort of stuff, then I do believe that it'll burn in less, or it will take a longer time to burn in. I just don't want to sit here and say it definitely won't burn in, or it'll take a really long time to burn in, or something like that. I just don't really have the data or evidence to know one way or another on that. So yeah, if I was a programmer, I'd probably steer clear as much as possible from OLED, and probably still prefer LCDs for that use case. But then again, if your programming use cases are sort of split 50-50 with gaming and content consumption, or even more towards gaming and content consumption, then the OLED may make sense. It also will make sense if you can afford to replace your OLED quite a lot. Things like the Alienware monitor do come with a 3-year burn-in warranty, so that's a consideration as well. If, supposedly, if you used it for programming workloads and there was burn-in, then you should be able to get a replacement by that warranty, of course, for 3 years. So you'd have to be comfortable with, that only lasting for 3 years. But definitely I would say that's one consideration, that you could still go with OLED. Again, you will have to consider things like glossy screen coatings versus matte and what's better for your use case. A lot of OLEDs do come with glossy finishes, which may not be as suitable for use during daytime applications. There's certainly a lot of considerations there. But I think my general recommendation for someone being a programmer, especially someone whose full-time job is a programmer doing that sort of work 8 hours a day, would be to stick with an LCD. Have pixel response times on LCDs improved dramatically in the last few years? Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it sort of prompted me to go back and have a look at the historic data that I've captured for response times on monitors since at least we have introduced this newest set of testing methodology that we're using at the moment. So it was a very interesting question, because I think we sort of saw a jump in performance around the time that the LG 27GL850 came out. So the first of those nano IPS 1 millisecond greater gray IPS monitors sort of pushed ahead IPS technology a bit in that front, and that monitor was released, I believe it was 2019. Don't quote me on that. Don't quite remember off the top of my head. It was definitely 2019 or maybe late 2018. Either way, that monitor that was sort of the shift that we saw, big shift in LCD performance. There were a couple of monitors prior to that, some TN monitors and so forth, that did have improved performance, but certainly that shifted IPS forward a bit. So since 2019, so that would sort of count the last couple of years, like the question has been asked, I've tested around 100 monitors using my latest test methodology. And looking at this scatter plot, you can see that there is a trend for best performance, so best greater gray performance, so that's running the monitor in the best overdrive setting at the highest refresh rate, that there is a general trend down in terms of response time performance across the monitors that I've tested. Now, this data could be biased a little bit by the fact that it's only the monitors I've tested. So over time, I have preferred to look at monitors that I think are the most interesting, which may be more high-end products, maybe cutting out some of those slower VA monitors over time from the monitors that we have tested. But generally, over time, the interesting, high-end, highly recommended products that we've tested on the channel, and we tend to cover at least what I think is most of the really good products that you should be considering, we do see that downward trend. However, this is sort of looking at all monitors. So when we look at all the monitors we've tested, there is a downward trend. But if we look at the best performing monitors from this group, down the bottom of the scatter plot, which is the lowest response time monitors, it's been relatively flat. We've seen the Samsung Odyssey G7 come out with its VA panel, and that did have quite good response times for peak performance. And response times for LCDs have been relatively similar to that since then. All the future VA monitors from the Samsung Odyssey line have had very similar response time performance. We have seen a couple of really fast IPSs come out. PG27AQN is one example that has sort of pushed IPS a little bit further, but hasn't broken through that established baseline VA barrier from those Odyssey monitors significantly. It is a fast monitor. It definitely performs very well in our charts. But yeah, it feels like for the best of the best LCD products, that certainly since 2020 or thereabouts, the performance has been fairly similar. But it is still good to see that overall trend of monitor performance getting faster over time. So your general monitor that you'll be buying, you could expect over the last 4 years or so to be faster. This also is applied to average cumulative deviation. So this isn't just the highest refresh rate, best response time setting, giving you that sort of performance improvement over time. It's the entire average performance of the monitor, including low refresh rates, because of course one way to cheat would just be to optimize performance for high refresh rates and completely throw out performance for the lower refresh rates, which tends to be an issue with LCDs. The faster you make those high refresh rates, the worse overshoot you get at the lower refresh rates. But the cumulative deviation numbers that we have do suggest that that's not really what's happening. It's not just pushing speed up at the high end and letting the low end performance get worse. It is a general trend of monitor performance getting better. Cumulative deviation has been getting lower over time, which is a positive trend to see and a good trend to see. The trend line isn't as aggressive as what we see on the other side of things, the response time side of things. Not that you could really call that chart an aggressive trend line, but it hasn't been as, I guess, steep of an improvement. But again, it does show, at least based on the monitors that we've tested, that there has been an improvement in performance over time, and I would expect that trend to continue as we see the introduction of new monitors targeting 1440p 360Hz. We've got 1080p 500Hz coming out this year as well. OLEDs were not included in these charts. Obviously, that is going to incentivize LCD manufacturers to improve performance further as OLEDs get more and more prevalent for gaming and high performance monitors. So yeah, I don't think I would describe it as a drastic improvement or drastic performance improvements, but it is still good to verify that there have genuinely been performance improvements over the last few years. So that about does it for the Monitors Unboxed Q&A for February. Really appreciate all of you guys that submitted questions for this video. As always, there were far too many questions to get to in the one video, but I always appreciate people that support the channel, whether that's asking questions, subscribing to the channel, liking videos. I've even seen some super thanks for our recent reviews. Really appreciate that if you were some of the people that did do that. So yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks for watching. Do consider supporting us via Patreon or Floatplane. Links are in the description below for access to things like our monthly live stream that we just did. You can watch a replay of that if you're interested. We've got our Discord community as well if you want to chat about monitors. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.